I'm going to talk to you about London Underground. As it's been said, welcome to London Underground. Before you go, do try and pop your head out the door and have a look at the views. It's interesting, this building, when it was built, was the tallest in London. Not quite that anymore, but it also caused the fire brigade huge headaches because they didn't think it could be built, because they weren't entirely sure exactly what was going to happen. There was a fire and how they get the water up here, hence some of the big equipment you see around the place. So anyway, welcome to London Underground. I'm just going to talk, I think, relatively quickly, given the time, through the context of the Underground, some of which hopefully you might know, some of which you might not, about our capital delivery, our plans and our priorities, and then really the role of asset management, and then finish up with kind of how we're using the Salvo toolkit and other things to help us in our decisions. So I guess the Underground and its story is about growth, it's about demand, and as many of you might experience, it's about crowding. Sometimes you kind of step back when you're working in an organisation and you try and appreciate the scale of it. 1 billion journeys a year on London Underground alone. Got 11 lines, 662 kilometres of track, 270 stations, 426 escalators, all of which are big and complicated machines. We've got more than 670 trains, and on our fastest line, or at least our most frequent line, the Victoria line, we're running up to 33 trains per hour in the peak. Now, to put that in some context, that's a train about every 90 seconds. And we actually have more trains in service in the morning peak on the Victoria line than we have platforms to put them in. So the sort of reliability that we're trying to get out of the system, given the amount of people that we're trying to shovel through, and if something goes wrong, we're immediately into difficult situations with trains in tunnels and so on. We're also responsible for the DLR, and London Overground, the Tramlink and so on, all of which are different systems and have their own challenges. And the DLR, and particularly the Overground, are quite significant in their scale in their own right. Things are going all right. We've got the highest customer satisfaction we've ever had. We've been through some dark times. We've been through some macro experiments as to how to do asset management, usually deals struck by the Treasury and so on about how we should contract things. We've come out of that period, and we're into a place now where we're trying to build on the recent success and some of the investment that we've got. Every morning, about 75% of all the journeys to work in London come in via the rail network. So if we get it wrong, it is a pretty big deal for London's economy. It's a pretty big deal for the customers, and of course it's a big deal for the rest of us who end up in the BBC studios or on the Evening Standard or whatever. So it's a lot of pressure every day. And underpinning all of that, you can imagine with the operators jumping up and down day in, day out, is a core process of asset management. And that's why we're really keen to invest in that, because it's the long term that actually makes for the short term success. We've got a big investment programme, over £1 billion every year. In fact, it's one of the biggest investment programmes of its type in Europe. And we are pretty much tinkering with most bits of our network all at the same time. You will have seen some of these, the impact of some of these around the place. The Jubilee line upgrade, terrible while we were doing it, fantastic now we've got it. Victoria line I've talked about, new trains popping up on the subsurface, and in fact just recently on the Circle line. You get some really bemused looks from customers when they step on one because they think they're in the wrong place. And obviously lots of this was focused about getting ready for the Olympics last year, including all sorts of things, including, and we're not skiing, a cable car, which was a new one for us. Even with all of that, and even with all of the investment that we're doing, really the phenomenal growth of London is the thing that drives our decision making. So that equates to about 25% increase in capacity over the last 10 years, but at the same time we've got about a 45% increase in demand. So it doesn't take a terrible mathematician like me to realise that every train's getting that little bit more crowded, and the pressure on the system is getting incrementally more and more each year. But it's not forecast to stop. So these two maps, just very briefly, this is the forecast increase in population for London. The red areas are where it's going to increase most. And of course, on the right-hand side here is the employment for London and where that's going to increase. And of course, if you're in the business of transport, it's going to keep us in business because it's not exactly coincident that the jobs are going to increase where the housing is. And so one of the things that we are responding to is not only the demand we see coming at us, but also the demand that we have to stimulate. So we have to invest in areas that are currently wastelands and poor housing stock and so on, so that by dint of having a London Underground system or some kind of light rail system there, they then can regenerate and London can continue to grow. And the Docklands, if I had time I'd tell you, but the Docklands is the greatest example of that, of course, with the Jubilee Line extension. So we're in the middle of doing things at the moment. We're in the middle of an upgrade of the Northern Line. If you don't know that we're upgrading the Northern Line, that's fantastic news because it's not going badly wrong. It's precisely the same system that we upgraded the Jubilee Line with, and that went terribly wrong, but we've worked out all the bugs, he says touching wood, and the thing seems to be operating quite well, and we're about a third of the way through the rollout. We are just starting on the biggest challenge of them all, which is what we call the subsurface railway, which is all those railways, all those bits of our system that have bigger trains on them, and the Metropolitan Line, District Line, Circle and Hammersmith, the Cape 4, around about 40% of the entire network, and we're about to replace the trains and the signalling on that. The capacity we get out of each of those is there to see. So really, we're going to do that. We're going to carry on. We're going to do more on the Northern Line. We're going to try and get even more on the Victoria Line, 36 trains an hour. Whoops, gone too far. And the same on the Jubilee Line. And underpinning all of this is going to have to be the reliability I talked about earlier. But like everybody else, it's not a bottomless pit. We might be spending over $1 billion in CapEx and $2.5 billion in OpEx. But of course, in the spending review just gone, like everybody else, we had to cut our cloth somewhat. And I was facing a 12.5% cut. Now that is on top of the cuts that we've had pretty much every 2 years for the last 10 years. We've got a target of improving reliability by 30% by 2015. I'd like to say, sitting here, listening to everybody about the analysis and how you build things up from data and all the rest of it, that we sat around in a workshop and we said, you know what, if we invest all this, we can come up and we can do 30% more reliability from our assets. It was absolutely nothing of the sort. Boris stood up and said, you know what, you're going to be 30% more reliable. And he announced it to the press, and we read about it, and we said, fantastic. Let's crack on then. But actually, I would say to you that you've got to start somewhere, and I don't think we would ever have got the engineers and the operators to ever sit there and sign up to a target of 30% on top of what we've done already. I don't think we ever would have done. So there is something to be said for something that seems impossible to get people around the table. And of course, things like Salvo fit right into the middle of that, where we can start to really uncouple what we've got to do to solve these challenges. So our priorities, very briefly, to get around all the challenges. Well, the first is about reliability and indeed safety. The Underground is one of the safest metro systems in the world, and we need to keep it that way. We've got to get more capacity from the current network. We've got to grow the network, and we've got to improve our customer service, because all of you who are customers will expect the same things from us as you do from John Lewis or anywhere else, and we're a big beast and we have to reform quite quickly in that way. Underpinned, of course, by the usual things around efficiency and people, but increasingly by technology, and this is all part of harnessing that. So what's all this mean for asset management? Well, it's absolutely critical that we spend our money wisely. Others have talked about that. It's no different on the Underground. We've got to get new trains, we've got to refurbish trains, we've got to re-signal the network, and we've got to replace a lot of the basic infrastructure that we operate upon. The oldest bit of the Underground is 150 years old this year. That's a long time in the course of many businesses, and some of the things that we use day in, day out to control the system are over 80 years old. So there's a lot to do to manage obsolescence, to manage where you intervene. Quite often, sometimes, we don't dare even do any maintenance because nobody knows where the wiring goes, so if you switch off the lights, you don't know. And last weekend, we had an annual test, which is called Bismarck. It happens every year. Don't know why it's called Bismarck. Maybe it will sink the Underground, don't know. But it's an annual test every year where they power things down. And then you switch it all back on again, and everybody goes like this. And I can tell you, mostly it all came back on again. There were a few stations that were without any power, so we hunted around, tried to find out where they were going. But this is the sort of thing we're dealing with in terms of the asset information we've got. And trying to make decisions in that imperfect world is never very easy. So what are the challenges in asset terms? The first about reliability. I think the Olympics was excellent because we all spent ages in media training waiting for the dreadful day, and most of us didn't have to spend too much time in front of the media at all. So fantastic. Transport worked really well. It was all about the athletes. But actually there's no more low-hanging fruit for us left. We did a lot of investment actually in response, of minimising the impact of failures, but now we're into the business of trying to prevent them in the first place. Efficiency, huge target. Most people have spoken about that. And obviously, we are in the public sector like many, and we have to continually demonstrate how we're spending every pound of public investment wisely. Spending reviews are always a threat to the sorts of things that we want to do here. And finally, in asset terms, technology. It's a sobering thought that the underground used to run, and in fact today still does, run on conventional signalling being lever frames and air being pumped around a system and red and green lights and all of those sorts of things. The signalling systems we're putting on at the moment are all on the train. They operate by radio, and the most critical bit of infrastructure that we have is therefore things like high capacity fibres and so on running down the network. Now that's the same infrastructure that we use for our desktops, but yet we would always deal with our IT over here and we deal with our signalling over here. And so the convergence of technology and the management of that asset and understanding that when it moves so quickly is a real challenge for us in trying to produce these very long-term plans. So we think, I think like most, that if we improve our asset management decision making, actually what we're going to see is a very direct benefit to customers. Because if we can get that intervention right, then we won't have a train stuck in a tunnel and we'll be able to move people through and so on. And it's very tangible. We get it wrong, it goes wrong spectacularly. We get it right, nobody notices. It's a fantastic day. Efficiency terms, trying to change, and people have talked about it before, inspection and maintenance regimes, getting them exactly right. Can we reduce them? Can we optimise them? Can we do it in different ways? Every time somebody walks down a track at night, there's always a risk they kick something. If they kick something, there's always a risk when we put the trains back on the track in the morning, we have a signal failure. It happens all the time. So the maintenance interventions have to be exactly targeted to what they're trying to do, because they have unintended consequences for reliability and so on, just like they do in other areas. And finally, as I said before, selecting the right sort of technology, using it appropriately is vitally important. So others have talked about Salvo in some detail. I would just say that we have lots of complicated trade-offs to make, and going through the process in a structured way of understanding how you deal with these complicated systems that have many, many parts to them, many, many different assets, many different consequences is very important. And for us, the Salvo project has been something that's really able to focus on some structure and to get people around the table, as others have said, to improve our overall asset strategies and so on. So I thought I'd just give you just a couple of examples to think about, and I'm almost done, but these are just things to think about. If there are any engineers in the room, if you want a job, come and think about some of these. So the first one is, when is the optimum time to next refurbish an escalator? Now that may seem straightforward, but every time we take an escalator out, we have queues outside the station, we have huge press implications. So we can't just take an escalator out of service to maintain it, because we've got to get that right. But if it breaks, it's even worse. And what's the cost of these machines, some of which are 50 years old? What's the reliability we can expect from them when we don't have any plans? And what should we do about the new machines, some of which seem to break down more frequently than the old ones? So getting all these things understood, getting everybody to the same place and so on, very important. Second question, how much is it worth investing to reduce the weight of new trains? What do you do if you have a lighter train? You have less track wear, which is great, but normally we'll think about the track asset. We won't think about the train and the track asset, but clearly the two are related. And how would you increase performance and save energy? If you've ever been on a tube train and it's been too noisy to talk to your colleague with a very kind of ear-splitting shriek, that's because the rail profile is not correct and the train is grinding away, and eventually what happens is the rail breaks and we run over it at very slow speed, and everybody says, oh crikey, why is the journey taking so long? Well, that's an example of that. To give you another flavour for it, if you've ever been on a deep tube train and you think, crikey, it's hot down here, well imagine putting more trains through. What happens every time you brake? Where does the heat go? It goes into the tunnel. Tunnel's a big thermal sink, just like an oven, sits there like a big brick oven. So what do? Well, you want to put more energy in less energy in the first place, and therefore you can run more trains through at the same temperature. So lots and lots of difficult kind of trade-offs. And grinding, related to the one I said before, how frequently should we grind them? Trading off the direct cost of grinding. This is a grinder machine for the uninitiated, against improved reliability, performance, and longevity. I can tell you, if you live next to one of these lines and a grinder comes through at 1 o'clock in the morning, you're not going to be very happy. And every time a grinder goes through, of course, there's always a risk that things don't happen as they should in the morning. So lots of trade-offs. They cross boundaries between different types of assets. They cross boundaries between operators and engineers and funders and so on. And it does come down to the basic things. You've got to get the right solution, not the perfect solution, not the theoretical solution, but the right solution in the context that you have at that time. You've got to work out what the right time is to implement it. There's no point doing more than you need now because it causes unintended consequences. You've got to do it collaboratively because the wisdom of an organisation is in its people, no more so than London Underground, where often we don't have anything written down from the ancient days. And then finally, as I've alluded to a couple of times, you've got to do it with imperfect data. There's no point in trying, in my view, to try and make decisions and wait to make decisions until you've got every piece of information. You've got to make certain decisions. You should do it in a structured way, and you should do it in a way that is evidential, that you can explain to people why you've done it. And that's precisely where Salvo fits in. So thank you very much.